Good.
All right. So, 7 or 8 weeks in here, and we were just saying maybe not a ton to say about this particular bit of reading, but I will, if I may, start us off in that vein by saying that I think I don't have. I'm not. If I'm quiet, and as I look at my sort of sheet of notes here, maybe I have more to say than I thought I did. But if I'm quiet, it's not because I didn't like this week's reading, as much as I think I found this week's reading to be potentially sort of interesting in the way that it kind of moved us from one moment of the story to another. But I don't know that I have a ton to say about that.
Yeah. I mean, what we're talking about today is 3 sections. We're starting to expand. We've talked about this before. We think that for a book like this, it may have been a tactical error to be so conservative with the chunks of reading. We've decided to start reading bigger chunks.
Right.
And for today, we read a somewhat big chunk.
60 pages.
3 sections of chapter 6 of the city of God and deliverance from evil, which I believe, well, first of all, that section, collar and worse, and then an attack and a repulse. Refresh me if I'm wrong, but is it not this first section, the city of God and deliverance by evil, where Nafta and Settembrini get into the argument about the secular versus the sacred?
Yeah, it's a second sort of argument from that.
Yeah, like they have this big argument where, if I'm understanding it right, Nafta wants to say, look, if it doesn't come from the perspective of the sacred, then it's kind of useless. So you can, in the language of 2022, follow the science all you want, but proving that the earth revolves around the sun, or proving, such and such about gravity, or inventing this X-ray machine, whatever you got, all of that is kind of superfluous to the state of the human soul. And, I almost felt like he was trying to argue in his way that we forget sometimes that facts and reason and science are tools that we use as humans, not things to which we must bow. And the thing to which we must bow then is like God, according to Nafta, right? Like this kind of spiritual. Whereas I felt like Settembrini was trying in his own Settembrini way to make something of a case for the Enlightenment. Some kind of version of, come on, man, like in calling out the corruption of theocratic rule. And
right.
Is that jibe with the way you remember this debate?
Yeah. I imagine if we had a Mon expert in the room, there would be sort of faces being made, at the way this is sort of slipping past some of the, intricate complexity of the historical cultural moment that this argument is supposed to signify. But yeah, my basic takeaway was that this was a kind of ratcheting up, that we had that initial encounter from last week's reading where Joachim and Hans kind of accidentally happen upon the two, Nafta and Settembrini, and we have this kind of this I thought almost sort of like Hell's a Poppin' comedic thing where these two old men, so this is sort of, it's a barbershop scene. These two old men sort of arguing while the young men kind of look on bemused. But I feel like Mon sort of upped the ante in this one, partly because, I don't know about because, I'm not sure this is why the ante is up, but I feel like the ante is upped on this one in part because this was a conscious visit. They set out to make this visit.
Yes, they do.
To go sort of encounter these guys. And originally they're just going to talk to Nafta, and then Settembrini kind of shows up.
Right.
And
he doesn't want Nafta to have them alone.
Right. We realize later, after the conversation, when Settembrini gives them the warning about what a genuinely dangerous person.
He calls him a voluptuary.
Yeah.
Which I thought is that we might want to revisit that. That's a great insult.
Right. And my take, I think you're correct in terms of this kind of theocratic versus enlightenment kind of thing. But I also thought there was along the lines of that, I'll add that I think one of the things that's going on here is this idea that the state has a role in general, right?
Right.
But I think and in some ways this felt very timely. This felt not unlike some of the nonsense I see going back and forth on Twitter about what the government can and can't do, or what,
or should or shouldn't do,
or what my rights are, or how this thing is going to work. And I kind of got the feeling that NAFTA was trying to say some version of all this kind of business about the individual that you care about is really petty.
Yeah.
That what we should think about are these kind of grand arcs of religion, of nationhood, these kind of what I tend to, I'm sure this is the wrong way to really think about them, but what I think of as these kind of medieval concerns.
Yeah.
Where Settembrini is saying, we gotta, the sun rises and sets on the individual human being.
Right.
And then of course builds from there into things that I associate with early 19th century immigration into America, which brought us things like, labor unions and, these kind of, so-called leftist ideas of that the janitor matters and,
right.
and things like that.
Right.
And I may be giving Settembrini too much credit. In fact, I think I probably am giving him a little too much credit here.
But if one of them agrees with what you just said, it's not NAFTA.
Right.
I think is the point.
Yeah, and I think, NAFTA is trying to say, when he's talking about that heliocentric universe business, I think NAFTA is trying to say, like just go along with what they say, because they're what matters.
Right.
The bosses are who matters. And Settembrini, he's writing this giant treatise on suffering through the lens of art, or I guess through literature specifically, and he's thinking about this individual person in this way that I think is a relatively, maybe still a relatively new idea in the totality of human history. And so
while also interestingly, I guess it's a layered achievement by Mon. So much of it is framed, at least in Settembrini's mind, as a pitched battle for the one individual soul of Hans Kastrop.
Right.
And I looked this up on my phone while you were talking. I mean, this is all kicked off by Hans and Joachim remarking on the Pieta.
The Pietà.
Pietà,
The
thank
sculpture,
you. Which is a sculpture of Mary holding Jesus after he's been crucified.
Yeah,
and he's got this thing, and Hans, who now, I can't help but always be struck at how, you brought up everyday use before we started recording, and I think much like the older daughter in everyday use, Hans is all of a sudden, he's gotten a little taste of the humanities, and now he's like an expert on every frickin' thing, whether it's mushrooms and botany, and everybody else is stupid, compared to him.
Right, and he inserts himself into this.
He does, and so he's like, well, let me tell you about the Pietà.
Right.
And so, in a way, his fault. This whole argument, his fault, which is, I find interesting. So even though Settembrini is like, beware this guy, he's a voluptuary,
right.
Hans is kind of the one that's going around badgering people, talk to me about this, talk to me about that. NAFTA doesn't really give a fuck, about Joachim and Hans. Not really.
He's got it worked out.
Yeah.
And because of his philosophy, it doesn't matter if these other people are on board.
Yes.
And so the whole thing. Now I do suspect that there is a certain pleasure for him. And as a gray bearded professor myself, there is that sort of the pleasure of someone just showing up and saying like, well, tell me about this interesting thing,
right? Right.
And so there's that, but I think it's not baked into his philosophy that he has to sort of convince Hans.
Whereas Settembrini does feel compelled.
Yes, because of his values.
Because of his values, and also, I mean, I would suggest some personalities are just baked that way.
Well, I
Like
think,
that,
I
some
think
people
the two
feel,
are,
they feel the need to be heard and to be told that they are right.
well, there's
you
there's
know?
a chicken and egg there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like if you don't need to be heard and told you're right to feel like you literally understand how the universe spins, then you're gonna gravitate toward this vision of the world that doesn't require that.
That's right.
In that sense, but I think it's a good point that Hans kind of provokes this thing, and this is a real tangent, but I'm going to steal a minute or two to say this anyway. But when I was a first year college student in Central Florida, at a community college, not really with any kind of understanding of what I was doing in school, except that it sure beat the heck out of picking watermelons.
Right.
I took an art appreciation class that spent maybe like 4 weeks. I would not swear to this, but in my memory, we spent a very long time studying like 7 or 8 different kind of masterworks, which were these pietas. It's like a category of sculpture.
Yeah.
And it's always Mary holding the dying Christ. And we spent all this time kind of talking about, not just refinements in terms of artistic style, but how these refinements reflected certain kind of religious cultural ideals, and how in some ways there's this kind of really interesting thing tied in with this Pietà, right? That is, I guess, central to the sort of Christian mysteries in general, which is, here is this really intimate, like I might kind of missed up a little bit here thinking about this really intimate thing of a mother holding her dying son. He's 30. He's not that old.
Right.
And he's in her lap, looking up at her dying. Right. And it's intense in this like little tiny human being, in a great big world way.
Yeah.
But at the same time, right, within the sort of mythologies and mysteries of Christianity, this is also this literally like world changing moment, right? This is the moment where Jesus has like wiped the slate clean when it comes to the Garden of Eden and all that business.
Right.
And so on the one hand, this is like two people sharing a deeply personal tragedy as it's happening. On the other hand, this is a geopolitical, philosophical, religious nuclear bomb going off, and the two sides of that I think are really interesting, because this is also something that I think lines up with the Settembrini-Napta divide.
Napta's interested in the cosmic implications.
Right, and Settembrini is like, but a dude is dying.
Right.
And I think it's really interesting that these two things go together. And I just want to say kind of like holla to the liberal arts, right?
Yeah.
Because I think this is, I've been complaining, and I'm sure I will again, at what I sometimes think of as the kind of unnecessary erudition of this book.
Yeah.
I spent quite some time researching those catacombs that are mentioned right towards the end of today's reading.
Yeah.
And come to find out they're actually really historically this thing that people have been interested in for hundreds of years, and
right.
And in 1910 Europe or whatever, these were something everybody was talking about. But it also seems like this really unnecessary kind of reliance on a kind of like fleeting historical moment in its way, plus all of the classical references and everything. Just it sometimes feels like a burden.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I will say I feel like one of the things that this book does, as a lot of modernism does do, is really reward that kind of classic liberal arts mindset that sort of invites you to experience that sort of ungovernable multiplicity of ideas happening at once.
Yeah.
And I will say, I recognize the achievement of invoking.
And I mean, that might be, going back to the title, which he also got from a classical reference, part of what makes the mountain magic. Is that Hans, and this maybe relates to the way you were talking about college students as well, unburdened by unburdened by the workaday life that had dominated his mind all the years before he went up the mountain, where he was all about efficiency and just doing what he was told.
Right.
Unburdened by having to be an engineer, even though Settembrini keeps calling him one.
Right.
Unburdened by ties to his uncle, which we got to talk about because that was funny.
Well, I definitely get to that.
Unburdened by so many things. He's experiencing, I mean, I still say he's a little bit obnoxious with the way he's just been exposed to this stuff and now he's the expert. But it's also kind of exciting to be exposed to the kind of ideas you were just talking about.
Right.
And he's
thrilling.
never had this before.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in a way, it's like, it makes me like him better than I like Joachim, who's just like, you know, we didn't come up here to get wiser, we just came up here to get healthier. And Hans's point is, dude, we're like laying down for 7, 8, 9 hours in a row. Like, if you're not reading,
What are you?
yeah.
Yeah.
Like, what are you going to do exactly, you know? Like, hey, man, I've already put together, at least in my own mind, a torrid love affair, and I've started studying some subjects.
Right.
So I've done some work with my time.
Right.
But speaking of Joachim, that was a very important development in today's reading. He leaves.
Yes.
He snaps at Herr the Hofrat.
Who snaps back?
Who snaps back. He's pissed off. He's like, well, both of y'all can leave if that's what you think, you know.
I
Hans
love-
has to be like, but I didn't want to leave.
I love this scene, right? This is 440.
Okay.
439.
Yeah.
The Joachim says, "I'm going. I'm
Right.
done." Right. And that's that, right? And then the Hofrat turns to Hans, right? And he's like, "What about you?" And he's like, "Well, I'd like to ask your opinion." And it's clear, right? I'm reminded very much of that moment where like a 12-year-old gets an invitation that is a little too scary, you know,
Yeah.
like the first sleepover or something
Yeah.
like that. The 12-year-old looks to the parents, and it's clear that what they want is for the parents to say no,
Yeah.
to get them off the hook without them having to acknowledge that
Yeah.
they're scared. I think very much this is what's going on with Hans here.
Absolutely. He
You
doesn't
know,
want to leave.
He says, you know, what do you think? And the Hofrat says, this is towards the end of 439. My opinion, good. He drew him to him by the arm and began to tap and listen. He did not dictate. He went rather fast, right? So he's just like doing the exam, like, you know, we're done with all the niceties, right?
Yeah.
Doing the exam, and he says,
You may go.
You may go. Boom. And Hans is freaked out, right? He
Yeah.
really wants to stay.
Yeah.
And then there's that kind of great moment on 440 that is sort of the end of that top paragraph. Where he's just the doctor's lost it, right? He advanced his head like a steer with staring, bloodshot, watery eyes. "I won't have it," he bellowed. "In the first place, I'm not the proprietor here." And
I'm on hire. I'm a doctor. Yeah. I mean, I feel him here a little bit.
and I have to say, I think this is a really interesting moment, especially in context with the stuff that we're saying earlier. That here's this guy who Hans has been walking around for a year, thinking kind of like holds his destiny in his hand, you know, and he's like, "Who do you think I am? I just work here."
Right. I mean, it's kind of hard to take when you play the perspectivist game, because it does seem like he was dicking Joachim around. Like, Joachim would come down there, he'd tap around him a little bit, and he would just kind of blithely be like, "Yeah, I think another 6 months."
Yeah.
Then when Joachim calls him on it, he like gets all mad, and he's like, "Fine, tap, 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 you're cured." And it's like, well, you're kind of contradicting yourself. Like, you know, so I see his frustration and how he sometimes gets tired of being accused. But he is kind of guilty of making people feel like they have to stay for 6 months, for a year, even when they may be done. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get the feeling that a lot of people are winding up staying here that don't really need to be here. I mean, like, I don't know, I'm not a medical doctor, but I get the impression he's, on behalf of the proprietor, perhaps, he's doing a little more than erring on the side of caution. He's creating a culture where the default is to stay. And I think he has some culpability for that Joachim's finally just over.
Well, I think it is true, right? That he says, you know, he keeps telling Joachim, if you go down now, you're just going to come back.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
And and when Joachim's finally like, I'm just going to go,
yeah.
I think he's not really retracting his diagnosis when he says, "Fine, go."
Yeah, yeah.
It's more like it's more like a recognition that he's not in a position to lock Joachim up. That this
Right.
always has been Joachim's
Right.
decision.
That's right.
And Joachim's all impatient now. And the doctor's kind of like, well, don't listen to me then.
Right.
But there is this thing, and I think you've probably experienced this, probably more so. I imagine that this is something that parenthood probably delivers to your doorstep a fair bit. There's this kind of like, well, somebody asks your advice, and then you give them your advice, and they're like, yeah, I'm not going to do that, and then you think to yourself, well, man, why did we bother with this?
Right.
If you aren't going to, why did you ask me?
Right.
If you're not going to do it. And I think that's kind of where the Hofrat's
That's
at.
yes, fair enough.
And he's like, look, man, you came to me.
Right.
I told you what I thought.
Right.
You want to go do your thing, go do your thing.
Right.
And it's interesting. But I also think, and I may be reading too much into this, but I think it's like a page page after that, on 442, that it becomes really clear that one of the reasons that Hans really doesn't want to leave is that he thinks Claudia is coming back soon.
Right.
And I'm wondering how much, whatever that is, I want to call it a love triangle, but I feel like that's a little bit inflated. But this thing with the Hofrat and Claudia and Hans all mixed in. Oh, this reminds me, we need to talk about his new table mate too.
Yeah, yeah.
But whatever that is, I wonder, to what extent, I mean, I'm not doing a very good job of saying what I mean here. I wonder if what we're seeing here is this kind of glimpse into the sort of human condition of this doctor, who in some ways has a pretty bad job.
Right.
Helping these people who can't really be helped.
Right.
Who's all alone. Maybe he had a thing going with a patient. There are all these rumors. Who knows? But if we're supposed to believe that Claudia is this special, magical, desirable person, maybe he is at the same sort of loose ends that Hans has been.
Maybe so, yeah.
And it almost feels like what we're seeing is this irrational overreaction from the doctor, and with Claudia's name coming back up really for the first time in a while.
In a while, yeah.
I wonder if partly Mann wants us to sort of wonder if Claudia isn't this other shoe for a lot of people on the mountain.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. Is it an oversimplification to say one of the implications of that is he would be rather glad to get rid of Hans because of the Claudia tension?
I think that's not an oversimplification. I think if we said that was all that was going on, it would be an oversimplification. I think it might even be just something like he's on edge. She's lonely.
I mean, he does, though, in fact, end up saying Hans some version of, just a few pages later, oh, not to worry, I'm of course glad you're staying.
Right. Yeah.
So, all gets repaired. And then, of course, and I know you want to talk about the table mate, so I'll let you pick. I mean, do we want to get to the uncle next, or do you want to talk about the new table mate next, or do you want to combine?
Well, let me say one thing first, and then we'll kind of, I guess, see what makes sense from there. But something that kind of stood out to me, and I think the beginning of today's reading, where Hans is kind of by himself a lot, and he's doing these walks, and he's doing a lot of kind of retrospective thinking about, oh, this is the place where my nose bled, and this kind of thing, which in some ways is setting us up for the uncle. So maybe that's the natural next step. But I feel like there's this definite pause here, and I guess it's partly because we're at this kind of annual moment, this anniversary, the milestone, I guess. But I feel like there's this thing where Hans is he's taking stock, and the book specifically uses this phrase on 442.
Yeah. More than once it uses the phrase taking stock.
It makes it emphasizes it. It would be the abandonment. This is about a quarter of the way down the page. It would be the abandonment of certain comprehensive responsibilities. Just the language there.
Yeah.
Which had grown up out of his contemplation of the image called Homo Dei, it would be the betrayal of that appointed task of stock taking, that hard and harassing task, which was really beyond the powers native to him, but yet afforded his spirit such nameless and adventurous joys. And this is him sort of thinking about, where he's got, on this journey, on the mountain, there at the sanatorium, but I was taken with this language of stock taking, right? Because unless I'm wrong, and I didn't double check this, but this is a mercantile term. This is inventory.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because, my dad worked at a place that had a big warehouse, and I remember as a kid, inventory happened twice a year, and it was a big deal. Like he would be at work for like 16 hours,
Yeah.
and they would just count everything in the warehouse,
Yeah.
once or twice a year, and it was like the kind of thing where the boss, who was not especially generous, even sort of recognized that you had to like provide meals and a keg of beer, and, all that kind of stuff, because these guys were doing this thing. But now I think of inventory much more in the context of like mental health and
taking stock also.
Right.
Those terms have
they've
become
been
psychological.
adopted into this thing, but that mercantile sort of language, is a callback to this flatland world, which in some ways is really making what I think is the clearest, most vigorous attempt to bring him back in today's reading.
Yeah.
In some ways, and so it's an interesting mixture of things that he's taking stock. He's doing inventory of this experience in this way that suggests he's still sort of thinking like an engineer, like this good German, productive, efficient
citizen.
At the same time that he has broadened himself enough to think about these things in really different ways, in terms of how he values these experiences. And this is something, of course, that the uncle can't. I don't know if he can't see it or if he sees it and it's just too horrifying.
I think that's what happens to him. I think when he starts flirting, which is the woman that he gets into?
Yes.
I can't.
Let's see. The uncle shows up.
Fra Radish.
Something like that.
Fra Reddish.
Yeah.
Or is it Solomon? Hell, I can't remember which woman it is. But I think once James sees himself falling into the rhythm and swing of the Berghoff.
Right.
And that includes fidelity to the meals and getting caught up in weird romantic vibes. And once I think he sees himself on the verge of being seduced by what he knows now has seduced his nephew fully. Mm-hmm. I think it horrifies him and freaks him out, and he immediately just leaves.
Yeah.
Like, without consulting the doctor. Like, he doesn't do a song and dance like Joachim does. Because the doctor, of course, told him too, I think you might. Like, that's the thing about, again, I can kind of sympathize with. I mean, I agree with everything you said about the doctor. But, man, he sure does seem also like everything's a nail and he's a hammer, right?
Yeah.
The uncle shows up and within 10 minutes he's like, oh, well, I think you might have tuberculosis. And at that point in the reading, I'm like, shocker, that's your suspicion,
Right.
And so I get why Pineapple sees himself falling into the habit and then is like, oh, hell no. And I love the way that today's reading ended. I mean, I guess page 461, and he wished him a continued pleasant sojourn at House Berghoff. Was that said in mockery? If so, Hans Konstar found it highly disingenuous, for his uncle had been in no jesting mood when he cut short his stay. No, he had become inwardly aware. One could conceive him paling at the thought that even as it was, after only a week up here, he would find everything down below wrong and out of place, and that the feeling would last a considerable time before readjustment set in. It would seem to him unnatural to go to his office instead of taking a prescribed walk after breakfast, and thereafter lying ritually wrapped horizontal in a blanket, and this dread perception had been the immediate ground of his flight. Yeah, I mean, gosh, does it remind you a little bit of like, we've talked about how elusive this book is. Is it a little bit Lotus Eatery? Oh, you just read the Lotus Eaters.
I wrote that when I first read this.
Okay.
This is a few pages before. This is on 456.
Okay. So so you say things about the Lotus Eaters, because that's interesting that we both like decided that. So which passage are you thinking?
So this is the middle paragraph on 456. The consul was pleased to be jocose. The spirit of the flatland was still strong with him, and he made merry over his lesson, as he had earlier over the prescribed exercises after breakfast. This is the thing that's such an important part of the process of learning to wrap yourself in the blanket.
Yes.
Such a big deal, right? So as he had earlier over the prescribed exercise after breakfast, but when he saw the peaceful, uncomprehending smile, and this is when I thought, with which his nephew met his jests, a smile in which was mirrored all the serene self-assurance of the local tradition, alarm laid hold on him. He feared, actually, the impairment of his business energy, and hastily resolved to have the decisive conversation with the Hofrat as soon as possible. So he's scared. He knows that this is seductive.
Yeah.
He knows that, but it's not just seductive. It imbues Hans with a serene self-assurance.
Yeah.
It's
almost like being in a cult.
Absolutely. The other thing this makes me think of, and this is a bit of a weird connection maybe, but I think it lines up really well. There's this fantastic scene in Apocalypse Now where the Marty Sheen character, I forget his name, he's not Kurtz, he's the other one. Where the Marty Sheen character has gone upriver in search of Kurtz, and is at this bridge that's being contested, and there's this group of American soldiers, listening to Jimi Hendrix music, while being sniped at. The North Vietnamese are yelling at them from the dark and taking pot shots at them, and they're all kind of shambalistic, the Americans, and they go summon this guy who's like the one who knows what to do, and they have to go wake him up.
Yeah.
And he shows up, and he's just all swagger and silent, kind of stony competence, and he listens to the screaming voice for a minute, and then just fires this grenade into the air, and there's this kind of long pause, and then the voice is silenced. And so he's clearly the one who knows what's what.
Yeah.
And the Marty Sheen character says, hey soldier, do you know who's in command here? And it invokes all of this top-down military stuff and all of this authority and normalcy and everything. And the dude, this is great bit of writing. Great. I don't know. I hope what it turns out to be was this like walk-on cameo dude.
Yeah.
Just had a wonderful ad lib, but the dude kind of looks at him for a minute and goes, yeah. And then keeps on walking.
Yeah.
And so I feel like what's happened here is, the James has shown up. This guy who's used to certain hierarchies, certain respects, certain senses of how the world works, and is met not with that, not with the proper recognition of that, but we're rather with this treatment of like, oh, you need to be taught all of this stuff, and I know, and this unshakable kind of local fluency, and it terrifies him, because it's such a complete transformation, and it's cultish, but it's also deprogramming. Is what it feels like. At the same time, and I just think this is sort of fascinating, and so because what they're doing revolves around this rest cure. I tend to think of it in terms of the Lotus Eaters, and I know that's what people from the flatland, as they say in the book, care about. But it also feels to me like one of the really scariest bits, and then we're back to kind of like those first year college dorm room discussions at 2 a.m, right? Where it's just like, well, what if? It was just better to just wander here.
Yeah.
And I feel like part of James's response it points to the kind of real possibility that they're on to something.
Yeah. Yes. No, I mean, we've been talking about that, I think, for weeks.
Yeah.
You know, that you as the reader have to, in order to make it this far in the book anyway, but also just if you're engaging it honestly, have to accept that maybe this is better than what James represents. You know, and again, you know, at the same time, I think we can certainly continue the cult analogy. I mean, I could easily imagine one of the patients saying to James, you know, some version of, I'm sorry if what I'm showing you frightens you. You know, kind of stuff, right? Like, if the things that I'm saying terrify you so, you know, maybe it's because you need to look a little further inside. Like, I could easily imagine this very much, this business of one of us. So I thought it was almost, I mean, yes, it's a serious moment, and it also seems to be a moment of finality, that nobody's coming for Hans anymore.
Well,
but it is also somewhat funny.
Oh, it's hilarious.
Well, the way he just is like, you know what? No. You know, and leaves.
Well, it's like every stand-up comedian take on the horror movie ever.
Yeah.
You know, like, why are you running around? You know, going upstairs, going in the closet, going in the cellar. You pack up and you leave. There's a classic, like Eddie Murphy in the 80s. Like, get out, okay?
Yeah.
And you know, James hears the voice and he gets out.
Yes.
But I do think it's sort of interesting. There's that final, that very end paragraph where Mon maybe for the first time, like, laying it on a little more thickly than I think is necessary. You know, kind of the conclusiveness of this. But before that, the thing that seems to be the final moment comes at dinner with the Hofrat.
Yeah.
Where James, he seems like he's gonna, like, be part of the group or something. And partly it's because he's there with Frau Reddish.
Right.
This is about a quarter of the way down on 460. They're hanging out, you know, talking to the doctor at dinner, right? And James unexpectedly asked him, you know, hollers down the whole length of the table, what was the process of physical decomposition?
It's a lot like Hans asking those questions from when he was first getting sucked in.
And everything about James's appearance, I don't mean how he looks, but his arrival, you know, reflects really closely Hans's, right? He's red-faced, he's feverish.
He thinks he's only going to stay for a couple of weeks.
Right. And so, in a way, him leaving is in fact the correct thing.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you know, I think it would be really great so way back when I taught for the Red Cross, we would do these, I don't know what to call them, these kind of practice sessions that were sort of gamified, where the instructors or sometimes we'd get, like, actual EMTs would come in and they would create these scenarios. And then different groups of people would, you know, you'd be outside and unaware of what was going on, and then they'd bring you in and say, okay, here's the scenario, what do you do? And it was this kind of attempt to kind of help people get into the moment and see where the flaws in your process were, so that in an actual emergency you'd be better off. And one of the ones I always remember was this scene where you just come up on all of these people who are, like, apparently unconscious. What do you do? And I was like, I know what to do. And I ran in and I was, like, putting everybody in the recovery position, and I was checking airways and all this kind of stuff. And they just let me go. And I did, like, 45 minutes of first aid and walked out, and I was like, you're welcome. You know? And the people in charge of the scenario were like, wow, you didn't even notice all that poison gas. Right. And so James kind of, you know, James gets a whiff of it, and he's out the door.
Yeah.
You know, but he the final straw, it seems, is this conversation with the doctor.
Yeah.
Right. You know, that goes into such great sort of graphic detail about decomposition that is also, I couldn't help but think, an awful lot like his sense of what curing tuberculosis is like.
Yeah.
Right? That basically you just got to get dried out.
Yeah.
You know, he's always talking about these moist spots.
Right.
Right. But then he says, you know, that you know, you got to pop, right? He says, and then after that, you're okay. Right?
Yeah.
Quite the gentlemen they are, all dried up and elegant. Everybody respects them. The main thing is to get well stunk out.
Right.
And it sort of is a sort of
Well,
interesting-
look at the paragraph after that. Certainly, of course, said the consul, thanks very much. The next morning he had vanished.
Yeah, right. And it seemed like, you know, there's some kind of not a moral lesson necessarily, but there's some kind of preview into something for James.
Yeah.
You know, where he sees something about this process, and I can't help but think that getting wrapped up in the sleep sacks or whatever, you know, is a little bit like getting mummified.
Yeah.
And this idea of getting, you know, good and dried out, and
Yeah.
it seems like it's there's something to that in the kind of single-mindedness of this particular medicinal approach. But then when we get to the actual last paragraph of today's reading, right, it takes on this more metaphysical, you know, kind of cultural understanding of this that I think is really interesting, right? Because it uses some really interesting language. The failure of this embassy marked a crisis,
Right.
in his in Hans's relationship with the world below, right? It meant for him, this is very at the very end, it meant for him the consummation of freedom, the thought of which had gradually ceased to make him shudder.
Yeah, I thought about Claudia when I saw that quote, because Claudia, in that long French conversation, is some version of, I don't know about you, but there were a couple times, especially in the restaurant days, where there would be, like, you know, a woman who worked in the restaurant that I would be super into, whose response would be some version of, listen, man, I don't think you'd be able to handle this. for whatever the reasons would be, right? You know, and Claudia kind of told him that.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, in fact, she's like, you know, if you thought about it a little bit, you'd be repulsed, she says. And her reason seems to be because freedom is her guide star. Freedom and independence are her guide stars. And as a German, and as a young man, Hans is just too much like James. He's just going to follow rules. He's always going to be a rule follower. Compared to him, she's like some wild barefoot pagan. And here, on page 461, it might be Mann's way of telling us, well, if what he's done is if he's achieved the consummation of freedom, maybe he is ready for her now.
Yeah, maybe this whole thing is in preparation for him.
I mean, I don't know if those are connected or not. I guess we have to wait on what comes next.
Yeah. I have to say, partly, I'm feeling like we're on sort of the downhill side of this.
And I mean, we're going to read another big chunk.
I think we might be 4 more sessions from done. So
we got about 300 pages to go. So 3 or 4 more sessions. Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like, you know, it is time to start thinking of conclusions. And I think maybe I'm putting too much into this word crisis here, but I kind of feel like, you know, in that sort of classic narrative plot, you know, we're not at like an actual crisis, but I feel like we've tipped into something that is the beginning of resolution.
Yeah.
In some ways, it could be that this crisis is not going to be quite so cleanly defined as it sometimes is in plots. But I'm kind of, for the first time, really sense the X-ray scene. I'm kind of like really looking forward to seeing what happens next.
Yeah.
And so I'm excited about that.
Good.
I was going to recommend, I don't know how this sounds to you, that we start at Operations Spiritualis here on 461 and maybe push it to 523 up to A Soldier and Brave.
Okay.
That gives us about another 60 pages, a little bit more.
Yeah.
62.
Well, that would almost, we would almost finish chapter 6. We would be one section away from finishing chapter 6 if we do that. And I think that's fine.
If we pushed into that if we push through that section, though, my concern is that's a big section.
Yeah, we'd have to go all the way to
that
567.
pushes us into 100 pages of reading. That feels ambitious. I wouldn't be if you had feelings about taking that big a bite. I would try.
Let's see what we think. I mean, if we say, look, we're going to go from 461 to 567. That is a little over 100 pages of reading, but we do have 2 weeks, and I think it'll just feel good to have finished chapter 6.
Okay.
You know, life happens. Maybe one of us won't get all the way to the end by 2 Wednesdays from now, but
Let's
you
aim
said
for
something.
that.
Yeah,
Let's
I
aim
mean,
for that.
you said something that I guess I would like to have on tape, which was some version of with this book. It does seem like the hard part is getting started. Like once you're in it a little bit, you can actually put away some pages in this book. It is readable in that way.
You're right.
But it is also can be a challenge to get up the gumption to get rolling again. So I feel like putting away 100 pages is very doable. And hell,